Hey, do you know that game, the one, crap, it's like in first person and you have a gun? Oh, you mean Call of Duty? No, there's like powers and everything. Oh, so you mean Bioshock? No, there's like corrupt leaders and stuff. Yeah, Bioshock. No, I'm telling you, the people in the game are affected by something and it makes them shells of their previous selves, and they go around attacking you, but a lot of the times you're just fighting human guards. It came out like 4 or 5 years ago and took home a lot of people's Game of the Year. Okay, so you mean Bioshock Infinite? Never mind.
Check.
What's up everyone, my name is AAA, and yeah, I know the intro seemed like a bit of a stretch, but I didn't want to give away everything now, did I? When Dishonored first came out back in 2012, I was upset because I was a huge fan of the Bioshock games. I'm so excited to do a game off on that at some point, by the way. And this game seemed to just rip off a lot of what made that game unique and interesting, and it just felt like this game was stealing that formula. After playing it though, I realized it played and felt a lot different, and the powers weren't exact copies of Bioshock. Still, at first glance, you can tell that this game is definitely influenced by that classic title. Just how much? Well, let's have a look. I'll be comparing Dishonored only to the original Bioshock, because the second Bioshock game was a bit of a different formula, and Infinite came out after Dishonored did. Just so you guys know. If you aren't yet familiar with the 5 levels of influence on this show, they are as follows. Level 1 is sober, from the point range of 1 to 20, meaning there aren't any big influences here. 20 to 40 is kinda tipsy, and 40 to 60 is hitting on that pretty girl over there. Here you can see clear influences of the other game, and you're all but certain that it took a good amount from the other game. Level 4 is dangerously close to a ripoff. I call it, yeah, of course I could do a backflip, dude, and it's between the point range of 60 and 80. And finally we have Wasted from the point range of 80 to 100, and I don't think that one needs any explanation. I'll be looking at different facets of the games. These change up slightly from episode to episode since something like gunplay mechanics was very important in my Lawbreakers Overwatch comparison, but it makes no sense in the Spider-Man Arkham comparison. And so for this episode I've decided on the following categories with the following weights. Traversal and level design will be out of 10, with 0 being no influence and 10 being a clear ripoff. Same goes for visuals and also for settings and themes. Story will be from 0 to 20, and combat will be from 0 to 25, with powers also being from 0 to 25. With all that out of the way, let's talk superpowered video game characters, shall we? Let's kick everything off with story, and this is a place where most games should get off easy, since it would be pretty much crazy to copy a story entirely from another game. And while the stories here are distinct, there are a lot more parallels than you might think. They're both about corrupt leaders and how you're supposed to find ways to get at them and take them down. The bad guy also has a hand to play in trying to control the population in some way, which ends up turning a lot of people into mutated enemies of some kind. You're guided and taught about your powers or the existence of them by a strange, mysterious man with not much backstory, and there's also a twist where, vague spoilers incoming for the next 10 seconds, a certain key player changes allegiances and screws you over pretty hard, and in the end you take down someone you did not expect. And depending on some choices you made in the background, you can get very different endings. Now, a lot of these are slightly more vague plot points. When you go more in depth, you can see Dishonored is a revenge story, in a realistic location that is plagued with disease and going through a period of time when a very corrupt person is in power. And you try and go around and find out how to find people of higher rank and dispose of them so you can finally get to the top and finish the big baddie off. Also, depending on how much blood you spill throughout, the ending will respond accordingly. Bioshock is the story of a man who doesn't know why he's there, uncovering secrets of this strange society built off of Ayn Rand's ideas of selfishness, and it showed how someone hand-picked people to be in his perfect society and gave them access to these powers, these plasmids as they're called, and when abused, those things can change the people living in the world into these crazed, inhuman splicers that are always attacking you. It's a game that makes you wonder who's really in charge and is about how this society was made and how it fell apart. It's a hell of a lot more of a social commentary than Dishonored is, but again, depending on how certain enemies are treated, you can get different endings. Now, when I explained the stories a bit more in depth, they didn't seem all that similar. But when I mention some of the similarities, you start realizing that a lot of vague background things, storytelling-wise, plot-wise, and sometimes even theme-wise, can be decently close to one another. Story is out of 20 in terms of how much it's influenced, and with the fact that when you take into consideration the different things that these two games were kind of trying for in the story, and how they usually had different outcomes that grew from the same roots, I can't possibly go over 10 points here. But still, the roots existed in Bioshock and they exist here. And while Bioshock and Dishonored are not the only games to ever have these roots, they're members of a small few in video games, and Dishonored is a game that's basic idea is clearly very Bioshockian, so at some point it's less of a coincidence and more of an influence. And for that reason, story-wise, I'll grant Dishonored a 7 out of 10. And for a section that's usually a freebie, this might not be a good sign for our friendly Dunwall assassin Corvo. Up next, however, we have traversal and level design, and while I love the spookiness and amazing atmosphere of Bioshock, and the simplicity of the levels make it seem pretty much as realistic as one can get with a game that's about an underwater city, verticality doesn't really exist at all here. I don't have a problem with that, but in terms of comparing it to Dishonored, the two seem to take very different approaches. Dishonored has open levels that allow it to be tackled in different ways, where you can take different paths and use the environment to sneak up on your enemies or go by completely unnoticed without killing a soul. On top of that, the blink ability is given free reign here, as the level designs really allow you to use it in a bunch of useful ways. Bioshock is a lot more linear and includes a decent amount of backtracking from what I can remember, and while you can tackle actual gunplay as you like, if you meet a splicer, you kill it. Simple. And you can't really use verticality and different paths here. You are given the ability to either engage or ignore big daddies, but that doesn't really have to do with the level design. Traversal here is usually just run forward, while jumping and using blink is a big part of Dishonored. I don't think the game earns any copycat points here for this category, so it might be riding the ship already. In terms of visual, the games look pretty different. Rapture is a desolate world with blue tints everywhere. It's an incredibly unique setting that feels haunted and hollowed out. Splicers are so mutilated, the whole style of the game is just very different from Dishonored, which dabbles in both night and day stuff and isn't always dark, which makes sense because Rapture is in the ocean, so it probably won't have that. Art style in Dishonored is like that of a painting, and it's really cool. Some of the enemies look a little bit different, environments look a little different, and the city itself looks very different. And overall, while I guess I can see some similar models and textures that can be seen in both, it's nothing greater than a 1 out of 10 in my opinion. Moving on to setting and themes, and while visually, like I said, the games look a little bit different, and are set in different looking locations, that's not all that setting means. Both games take place in a dystopian setting, in a broken world. Thematically, while Bioshock is a lot deeper in what it sets out to do, both games are about a one-man mission to take down a corrupt system, or to try and somehow make things better once those who are granted power end up using it for the worse. In fact, a central theme in both games is how just killing the corrupt doesn't necessarily mean you're a hero. You must fight your own corruption and continue to show care and appreciation for other living creatures. Otherwise, the world does not become better. In Dishonored, you fight your inner corruption by making sure you kill as little people as possible, which will grant you a better ending since you proved that you didn't relish in bloodshed or wish harm upon your enemies. You merely just wanted to right the wrongs they had committed. In Bioshock, you have to take a stance on either sparing the Little Sisters, which make your journey more difficult than if you decided to use them for your own advantage. However, if you do take this more difficult yet merciful route, you also end up unlocking the better ending. Not everything is the same. As I said, the actual physical setting is quite different between the two, but the type of world and one of the largest themes in both games are awfully similar to one another, so I think a 5 out of 10 here is in order. With 50 of our points now discussed, we're currently standing at a total of 13 points, and that's not too bad and on par for only a kinda tipsy rating in the end. But you're forgetting that the final 50 points are about combat and powers, and this is where people immediately drew comparisons of the two to begin with. So let's see how long this good score continues, starting off with combat. In Bioshock you acquire the following weapons. Your first and only melee weapon, a wrench, then you get a pistol, a machine gun, a shotgun, a grenade launcher, a chemical thrower, and a crossbow. In Dishonored you have your sword, a crossbow, a pistol, grenade, and a spring razor. Right off the bat you can see some similarities with the pistol and the crossbow, which are the only two main long-range weapons in Dishonored. And while the swordplay here is a lot more intricate and is integral to the combat in Dishonored, much more so than the wrench is in Bioshock, there's at least some similarities there also. You switch between ranged combat, up-close combat, and whatever your powers do pretty often in the games, and that's the main gameplay. Still, swordplay is a huge part in Dishonored's combat, more so than the pistol or the crossbow. Also, there's more flexibility in the combat, and you have a lot of stealth in this game as well. Bioshock doesn't really have those things. Regardless, the fact that powers exist in the first place, and the pistol and crossbow exist in the first place, shows that Dishonored most definitely took cues on how its combat would work, and how you would juggle different weapons and abilities. When you get right down to it, aside from the swordplay, most of what you do combat-wise is eerily similar in both titles. Not to mention the system for health is pretty much the same in these two also, with no regenerating health and instead needing to find these little vials all over the place to gain health. And while the stealth and flexibility of Dishonored most certainly sets it at least a bit apart, as does the swordplay, a lot of the main mechanics have clear Bioshock influences and the same weapons, although in Dishonored there are less to choose from. Also, not exactly combat related but still gameplay wise, you can rewire and hack things in both games as well. Honestly, it seems like Dishonored took a lot of combat ideas from Bioshock, threw in an extra sword that could attack and block to make melee more intuitive, and then gave you more flexibility in combat. But the undertones of Bioshock are still very, very visible here. The flexibility and the changes in how to approach certain things save this game from having a significantly higher score, but I'd say at least half of the game in terms of combat and how you juggle your abilities and weapons is very similar to Bioshock, so Dishonored earns a 13 out of 25 here, doubling its score from what it had before, and we haven't even talked about our final category yet. In terms of powers, the fact that they exist the way they do, being a sidekick and helpful tools on your mission, and the fact that you switch between them and your weapons would have gained it at least a handful of points even if all the powers were completely unique. On top of that, if you add the fact that the powers aren't exactly on cooldown most of the time, after a couple uses you'll have to find vials to replenish your abilities to be able to use them again, and that's exactly like what you had with Bioshock, and you have a very strong base of at least 10 out of 25 points here. And that's if the powers were fairly unique. While a few of them are, and they're very useful not only in combat but also in traversal and stealth, and are just in general a little bit more versatile, a couple others seem all too close to the powers in Bioshock. You might receive these powers in different ways, but that's not exactly a massive counter to anything I mentioned previously. I will admit that Blink, Dark Vision, and Bend Time are all really cool and unique, but a couple others seem more uninspired. Let's compare, shall we? Aside from the three that I just mentioned, Dishonored has 3 more powers, not including the passive powers like having more adrenaline, jumping higher, and having more health. The first of these 3 is Wind Blast, and it's described as blowing gusts of wind to break thin doors, extinguishing torches, and knocking down enemies. Bioshock has an ability called Sonic Boom, described as creates a powerful burst of air in front of the user, knocking back any enemy or object caught in the blast as well as dealing them damage. Okay, seems a little bit close. The next of the 3 is Devouring Storm, which conjures up a group of ravenous rats. Bioshock has Insect Swarm, which spawns a swarm of bees which will home in on the nearest enemy, damaging them as well as distracting them from the player. Finally, Dishonored has Possession, which at stage 1 possesses animals, and at stage 2 possesses humans to do your bidding, causing the possessed person to attack your enemies. Bioshock has both Hypnotize Big Daddy, which makes Big Daddies think you're a little sister and makes them leave you alone, and Enrage, which makes enemies mad so that they fight others around them. The first 2 things that I mentioned are basically exact copies, and the third thing I mentioned is practically the exact same, and since half the powers are kind of clones, I'll take the base 10 out of 25 and split the 15 points I had to spare in half and add it to the total, leaving us with a 17.5 out of 25. The 7.5 points it spares here are only because a couple of powers were unique and more diverse, since a good majority of Bioshock's plasmids were damage-based. So while some people might think the score is a little high, I honestly don't realistically think it warrants anything lower. With all those points tallied up, we get a grand total of 43.5 points, making Dishonored our first game to ever reach the 3rd level, hitting on that pretty girl over there. Look, Dishonored is not a clone. A lot of people prefer it to Bioshock, and although I'm not one of them, I did enjoy the game and I think it does enough to distinguish itself to the point that I don't feel like I was playing a Bioshock ripoff. It did, after all, not get past 50% copycat. Still, there are clear influences that no one can really deny here, and while overall I guess the games did seem a little bit different, there's no doubt that Dishonored took a lot from this 2007 classic. I don't really view Dishonored badly because of this, since a lot of really great games can see large influences from others, and we'll see that a lot as the Under the Influence series goes on, and I'd still recommend it to anyone who hasn't played it, but I can't say it's an entirely unique game. What do you guys think? Did Dishonored steal a bit from Bioshock, or did I rate it way too high? Which game do you guys personally like better? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, and until next time, this has been AAA, signing off.